Jeff has built a premier Great Basin research program in the United States. He is highly respected by professors at other universities who often advise their students to apply to Jeff's program for their master's and PhDs. Jeff's monograph, recently published by the University of Utah Press, is the topic, as Jim mentioned, of this evening's presentation. In the Shadow of the Steamboat, a natural and cultural history of North Warner Valley, Oregon. Please welcome Dr. Geoffrey Smith.
Thanks. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sounds fine.
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Dan, for that wonderful introduction, and it's nice to see you. Nobody told me that I would be competing for airtime with President Biden tonight, so thanks for tuning in. That's
I wrote him a letter about that.
I think that's a first for me. Yeah, don't ever let that happen again. Thanks to everybody at OMSI and online tonight. I do want to talk about some work that I introduced you to the last time I was at OAS, which was 2017 or 2018, and I had the beginning of this story written. Well, I want to share the end, or at least what I thought was the end, with you this evening. So I'll be talking a lot about In the Shadow of the Steamboat. That is Steamboat Point there. It's at far northern Warner Valley, about 45 minutes north of the town of Plush, if you've ever been there, and I suspect most of you haven't, past the pavement. So it's a wonderful place to have spent 5 years in the field and a number of years thinking about afterwards, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to a few organizations, in particular the Northern Paiute Tribe and the Klamath tribes, whose land that we conducted this work on. We've been working up there for a little over 10 years now on various projects, and it's been great to cross paths with community members over those years. I'd also like to thank the Bureau of Land Management, Lakeview Resource Office, Bill Cannon, who recently retired. Many of you may know Bill. He was instrumental in the support and execution of the work that I'll be sharing tonight. The University of Nevada, Reno, of course, my colleagues and friends here, as well as colleagues and co-authors from across the Desert West, which includes your own Dan Stuber, folks at the University of Oregon, Utah State University, UNR, Desert Research Institute. This is very much a group effort, and I'll try to draw your attention to contributions by people other than myself as we work through the talk. So tonight I'll introduce you to the Great Basin Paleo-Indian Research Unit. This is the organization that I am executive director for. As Dan mentioned, we work in the American West. We've been doing this for, I think this is my 13th year. And so we've been in remote valleys all across southeastern Oregon and northwestern Nevada. And then I'd like to quickly introduce you to the North Warner Valley Study Area, where we have spent 10 years working or conducting lab research. Highlight some background and project goals, touch on the main results, and then move into the discussion for this evening's talk. So many of you might know this already. If you don't, the Great Basin Paleo-Indian Research Unit, or the GBPRU, was established in 2010 through a generous gift from the Kramer family. The Kramer family has set up a number of privately funded research organizations across the United States, including Oregon State, University of Arizona, Kansas, and the University of Nevada, Reno. And so we're very fortunate to have the support from the Kramer family to conduct work like that, which I'll be describing tonight. And the primary goal of our work is to study early sites in the Great Basin, both archaeological and environmental. And so what we're trying to do is paint a picture of the past before about 9,000 years ago. And here are some photos from folks that you may know over the years. That's Richie Rosenkrantz in the top there. He's one of our current PhD students, and Derek Rayo, who recently graduated from the University of Nevada, Reno. Both of those fellows specialize in Western STEM technology. Some field school students from over the years. We conduct both archaeological survey and excavations, but also paleo-environmental reconstruction. So that is trying to understand what the landscape was like and maybe what attracted people to certain locations at different times in the past. And so on the bottom photo there, you see some of our field school students looking at a backhoe trench excavated across a pluvial shoreline by Dr. Teresa Riston at the Desert Research Institute. She was one of the project co-directors, and her focus was primarily at helping us understand what the environment was like. So these are some scenes from the field over the course of the years. We have a yurt made in Eugene, Oregon. And if we're fortunate, the BLM will hook us up with a trailer. We have a couple of trucks, usually a water buffalo, and we spend 3 months each summer in remote locations with periodic trips home to visit friends and family. We've played a lot of horseshoes over the years. We've had some fantastic meals. That photo on the bottom right there is Dr. Anna Camp from the Nevada State Museum and her husband, Nathan Molina. Nathan is an amazing chef, and he has a knack for feeding large groups of of people. And so we've had some wonderful times and wonderful meals out there. These are some scenes from our travels over the years. We focus primarily on Western STEM tradition archaeology. So again, before 9,000 years ago, though, our travels do bring us across fluted points and other types of objects. There on the left, you see a backhoe trench with a layer of beautifully preserved volcanic tephra, which sometimes allows us to put a time on these different ashfall events. That's my daughter, Millie Grace, there on the far right. My children, both Gavin and Millie, have accompanied us periodically over the years, most recently at the Connolly Caves. The focus of tonight's talk is work that was carried out under the auspices of UNR's field schools between 2011 and 2013. So the fieldwork portion of this project that I'm describing primarily took place during those 3 years, with a couple more years involving smaller crews. So if you've never been to Southeastern Oregon, first of all, you should go. It's an amazingly wonderful place with some of the darkest skies in the United States. Just to situate you, we're talking about Lake County and very southern Harney County, about 2 hours northeast of Lakeview, and again, about 45 minutes north of Plush. So Warner Valley is the focus of our conversation this evening. Prior to beginning the project, we started by delineating an area that we would like to focus our efforts on for reasons that I'll share with you in a minute. It covered about 221 square kilometers at the very north end of the valley. So if you've been to Plush or some of the Warner Lakes that hold water today, we're north of that. And this is a very dry area. Blue Joint Lake, which is actually dry, or at least it has been for the last 10 years, that's where we're talking about. So no standing water today. My predecessors in the 1980s and the 1990s, folks like Don and Catherine Fowler and Gene Hattori, Craig Young from Far Western, Bill Cannon, Mary Ricks, some of the folks that you may know personally or professionally, focused their efforts for about a decade down around the Warner Lakes, uncovering a really rich record of late and middle Holocene archaeology, with houses and food remains and lots of lithic tools. And through that work, they developed a really firm understanding of what life and environment was like after about 5,000 years ago. And that work has stood the test of time very, very well. But northern Warner Valley was largely unknown ground, unknown territory, both archaeologically and environmentally. And so in 2010, when I started, Bill Cannon reached out to me almost immediately and said, you know, UNR has been up here for a number of years. It's time for you to come back. And I said, okay. I was looking for a long-term project, and I was flattered and excited to be asked. What Bill described to us that was the hook was a series of Pleistocene shorelines shown here on the right-hand side of my screen. And so, as many of you know, as pluvial lakes receded with drying conditions at the end of the last ice age and through the Holocene, they would periodically pause, leaving shorelines that are visible today. And so these shorelines can sometimes be dated by collecting shells or bones or preserved plant remains within the shorelines. And we can construct what's called a lake history, which pairs elevations of collected samples versus ages of those samples. And so lake level research is a fairly common approach to understanding past environments here in the Great Basin. Within this general area, there was also a rock shelter that, to be honest, when I first saw it, really wasn't, it didn't look that promising to my naive eye. And I remember thinking distinctly after driving 2 hours from Lakeview in the rain on a cold spring morning, wow, I can't believe Bill brought me all the way out here to show me this little overhang. It really doesn't look that promising, but as been often the case in my career, I was wrong in retrospect, and I'm very happy to admit that. And I hope that you'll see the value in the work that we did. I just want to mention before I move on that these shorelines, these pluvial lake shorelines, often hold pretty impressive records of predominantly surface archaeology dating to the Pleistocene and early Holocene. So fluted and stem points, crescents, and other objects that you may have heard of. So we developed 3 goals that drove the work that I'm going to describe tonight. The first was to develop that lake level history that I was talking about. We really didn't have a good understanding of how Lake Warner changed at the end of the last ice age into the early Holocene and how people may have adapted to those changes. The second approach was to conduct a large-scale pedestrian survey of higher areas and lower areas and beach ridges, trying to understand where people placed themselves relative to food and other resources. We also wanted to know at what point in time the valley was heavily populated versus lightly populated. And finally, we wanted to excavate that little Steamboat Point, or LSP-1 rock shelter, which lay in the shadow of the Steamboat, to provide both chronological control over some of the surface sites in the area that could not be otherwise dated, except for the styles of projectile points that they held. And we also wanted to get some food remains because, as I mentioned, most of the sites in the Great Basin, at least in North Warner Valley, are predominantly surface and they lack food remains. So we're largely left to infer past subsistence remains through technology and site location. The rock shelter could provide direct evidence of people's food strategies. So this is that 221 square kilometer parcel. We sampled about 10% of it using random and non-random strategies, selecting 500 by 500 meter squares shown here on the valley bottom, across the beach ridges, and to a lesser extent in the upland canyons. And so we really tried to look high and low to understand the distribution of surface sites while we were also working in this rock shelter. And so we found that 500 by 500 meter squares could be surveyed with a group of field school students. We could do about 2 squares a day and record the archaeology that we encountered. So while I was marching the students back and forth in relatively straight lines across North Warner Valley, Dr. Riston was busy digging backhoe trenches across these different beach ridges, looking for datable material, sediment of different types, volcanic tephras, and any clues that could, again, provide data points that are a pair of elevation information and a pair of chronological information. She was fairly successful in this work. She ultimately opened up 33 backhoe trenches, diligently recording the profile of each, which is what are shown here on the right. On the left are some of those trench locations. She dated soil in some cases, shell in some cases, looking at the different types of organisms in those sediments to understand if these were deep water or shallow water locations, high energy locations, and low energy locations. This is one of the photos of those backhoe trenches again. That's a volcanic tephra that I think dates to about 23,000 years ago, if I'm correct. And so that allowed Dr. Riston to understand what conditions were like in the more distant past, prior to the arrival of people in North Warner Valley, at least as we understand that part of the story. And so after all those 33 trenches and all the lab work and the radiocarbon dating that Dr. Riston did, this is the first approximation of the pluvial lake history of North Warner Valley. And so, as I mentioned again, on one axis in creating a lake curve, here's the elevation of different samples. Across the other axis is time. So we're moving back in time to 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, and 20,000 years ago. All of these little icons here are different data points. So triangles indicate volcanic tephra. The hexagon, I think, if I remember my shapes correctly, are dates on shell. So at this point, for example, we have a date of 14,500 years ago. That's at about 1,390 meters. And then this is the surface archaeology, both fluted points in gray and western stem points in black with their frequencies. So what we were using these for is to, in part, help us tell time, and in part understand when and where people position themselves. 10 years from now or 20 years from now, if another generation of researchers go out to North Warner Valley, and we certainly hope they will, and work to refine this first approximation, this curve will almost certainly change. And that's the nature of pluvial lake curves, is you start with what you have in terms of your data points and connect those using your intuition and your best approximations. With additional data points, the curve will change. So as it stands now, here's our general understanding of pluvial Lake Warner over the last 17,000 years or so. So it reached its high stand at about 1,454 meters, somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 16,000 years ago. A second important point that I want to draw your attention to is during the Younger Dryas, which was generally a cooler and wetter period in the Western US, we see that lake pause or even rebound to 1,390 meters or so. That's around the time that people started to camp along its shores. By 10,300 years ago, we know that North Warner Valley and the entire North Warner Valley study area was dry. The lake had moved south, receding gradually out of our project area. And so people who were in the area at that time had the whole valley floor to explore and occupy. So again, this is what I just shared with you, looking at it from a plan view. So a very large lake at about 17 to 16,000 years ago, a pause to a moderately smaller lake during the Younger Dryas, perhaps a slight rebound, and then the valley floor is dry completely by 10,300. This lightest blue is our best understanding of water at 10,300. And again, this is where we're looking. So the entire area was dry. So what do we find back and forth across the desert for 3 years? 114 archaeological sites comprised of 10 or more objects, and 355 isolates ranging from a concentration of 9 artifacts to single flakes. We had a mule shoe, we had a couple of tin cans and bottles, but this was predominantly an indigenous archaeological record, spanning from Clovis times and Western Stem times to a few hundred years ago. We found 10 or 11 fluted points. Many of them are technologically consistent with Clovis points from other parts of the Americas. Here are some examples here, primarily fragmentary. Some of them bore the scratching on the channel flakes. That seems to be most common on obsidian examples. These two tables here on the right are simply designed to show you that most of the early archaeology, as I suggested a few minutes ago, was present along those beach ridges with a smaller degree on the valley floor. We really didn't find any fluted points or stem points at higher elevations, and that's largely consistent with the regional pattern. Moving down to the table on the bottom right, this is simply a comparison of the frequencies of projectile points of different ages between Warner Valley, where we worked, and other relatively well-studied areas, including the Fort Rock Basin, the Shuwakan Abert Basin, Steens Mountain, and Massacre Lake. So those locations have had enough work done that there's a fairly reasonable sample of projectile points across time. And so this allowed us to think about how Warner Valley might fit in this bigger picture. And the short answer is Warner Valley is extremely rich in early archaeology relative to these other areas that I just outlined. So this was a very productive and attractive location early in time. This is work that also featured Don Petit. I don't know if Don's here tonight, but he's a local Portland guy, and this was the focus of his master's thesis. We also found Western stem points, both long-stemmed Haskett points, which Richie Rosenkrantz's work has demonstrated date closely in time to the Younger Dryas, about 12,900 to 11,600 years ago. So older, towards the older end of Western stem technology. We also found a variety of smaller forms that seem to date to the early Holocene, and then of course crescents, which are still somewhat of an enigma in terms of their function and use. So let's put that archaeology from the surface surveys together with Dr. Riston's lake level curve and paint a picture of changing adaptation. Most of the fluted points and Western stem tradition points were found along or just above that 1,390 meter shoreline, which is dated to the Younger Dryas, suggesting that people primarily spent their time and energy along the shores of pluvial Lake Warner as it paused in its recession. Fluted points fell out of use, though they're not well dated here in the West. That's consistent with our understanding of their age on the American Southwest and Great Plains. And so that technology seems to have fallen out of use by the end of the Younger Dryas here. People continued to use Western stem tradition points well into the early Holocene as they moved down slope and out onto the valley floor as that lake disappeared. So early in time, at least based on site location, there seemed to have been a focus on lakeshore resources and lakeshore camping. But as that lake disappeared by 10,300, people needed a new way to make a living. So taking a broader look at change over time, we've got percentages of time-sensitive projectile points from our surface sites, a sample of 260 or so, predominantly an early Paleo-Indian record, very few early Archaic or Middle Holocene styles like northern side notch points. We see a slight increase in Middle Archaic dart points like Elkos and, Elkos were the main ones. There's a few Gate Cliff style projectile points. Also a Middle Archaic marker, 5,700 to 2,000 years ago or so. A modest proportion of late Archaic points, both Rosegate arrow points and smaller desert side notch points dating to the last few hundred years. I do want to point out that though we do have a few desert side notch points in our survey sample, they almost all come from one site. And it's a really cool site. If you know Scott Thomas, who retired from the Burns district of the BLM, he's developed this model for a suite of sites found across southeastern Oregon that include desert points, that include Tosui chert, that sometimes include pottery, which is extremely unusual in this part of the world, that include bison bones. And he argues that this reflects mounted bison hunters moving into the area when bison are present, which they seem to have popped in and popped out over the years. So it's a really cool idea. That's Scott Thomas's idea, not mine. So again, these are open air sites. We have no preserved food remains. We have tools used to process food. And so this is, by necessity, a very coarse-grained look at diet over time. But if we look at the proportions or average numbers of bifaces, which tend to end up as animal processing tools, including projectile points, and we look at the average number of groundstone, which are often used to process plant resources, and we look at how these change over time, we can get a very coarse sense of diet. And so here on the far left, during this Paleo-Indian period, before about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, lots of bifaces, very few groundstone. In contrast, during the early Archaic or the Middle Holocene, we see a high proportion of plant processing tools and a relatively low proportion of animal processing tools. And these lines go back and forth across time with a very high number of projectile points or bifaces at the end, which again is being driven by that one site that has bison or remains that actually Scott dated to about 350 years ago via radiocarbon dating, so relatively late in time. So putting this all together in terms of the survey data, thinking about population levels as derived from number of sites and number of tools, thinking about subsistence strategies based on site location and processing tools, and thinking about mobility strategies, that is, how are people moving between locations. These are some general trends that we inferred from the survey data. Early in time, there were more people in Warner Valley than any time later, including almost certainly today. Marshes were a focus. Hunting may have been a focus a little bit later in time as that valley opened up. We see these variables fluctuate over the last 13,000 years or so, with people oscillating between residential mobility, where consumers are moving as a group to food, and logistical mobility, where relatively stable groups are sending smaller parties to go collect resources and bring them back. That inference is drawn from the nature of these sites, small or large, diverse, dense, sparse, and so forth. One thing we never found during our surveys was any evidence of longer term camps, so really big, dense sites or anything that might be remotely construed as a village. So no residential features or anything like that. Later in time, those villages seem to be located down closer to Plush and around those well-watered Warner Lakes, or potentially down the rim around Lake Abert, where Chip Otting did a lot of his work in the late 1990s. So now I want to draw your attention to the little Steamboat Point rock shelter. There's a crew member there in the circle in the upper left. She stood about 5'9". So there's a fairly substantial rimrock formation here, but that's the shelter as we saw it in 2010. I couldn't stand up in it, not even close, as we excavated a test pit in the center of it. I continually banged my head, which didn't make the location very endearing to me. And so we spent 2010 and 2011 working here with field schools. 2010 was a 1x1 meter test pit. We excavated it to about 176 centimeters below surface. When I stood in it, it was about this high. It was a beautifully stratified site, really well preserved animal bones, lots of stone tools, a couple of campfires. At the end of the summer, we got some radiocarbon dates. Those came back at about 8,200 radiocarbons, so pretty old, but I was new, and that wasn't old enough for someone who was supposed to direct the Paleo-Indian Research Unit. So it was a cool site, but it wasn't where I wanted to spend 5 or 10 years working. In 2011, we expanded that 1x1 meter trench to a 1x4 meter trench, carefully excavating, taking it down to the same depth, or almost to the same depth, and found more of the same. A wonderfully preserved faunal assemblage with lots of rabbit bones and bits and pieces of larger animals, and a really cool array of projectile points and other types of tools. And radiocarbon dates, again, came back in the neighborhood of 82 to 8,400 radiocarbon years. So just before 9,000 years. And again, I was new and I was naive, and I just felt like this site wasn't old enough to answer the questions that I was charged with pursuing. So at the end of 2011, we backfilled the 1x4 trench with sandbags, carefully laid gravel over it, made it look like no one was there, and we went home for the winter. In the spring of 2012, we were doing another field school in the area that was only going to focus on survey and open air sites. Prior to the beginning of the field school on Memorial Day weekend in 2012, I brought my graduate student staff to the shelter to talk about the work we did. And that's what we saw in the lower left there. At some point, probably in the days leading up to Memorial Day, because there was still a lot of fresh silt and dirt in the disturbed area and the back dirt pile, someone had dug a huge proportion of the sediment and deposits out. So letter A there is denoting the looter's pit. Letter B is denoting that original test pit that went to 176. And C is the remnants of that 1x4 meter trench. So in a night, or perhaps two, people did the work that it would have taken us a decade to do if we were doing it carefully and professionally. The site was heavily damaged, and to their credit, the BLM really pursued this case and really gave it their best effort to catch the bad guys. And to my knowledge, they never did, which is really unfortunate. So we're left with this important site exposed in a very remote area that's just asking to be excavated illegally again and again. The BLM really had no way to control access to this location. And so after a long conversation, they invited us to conduct what was initially salvage archaeology, that is, determine whether there were remaining deposits left, and if so, excavate as much as we could so that at least there was some data recovered from this otherwise messy location. So we spent the next few years excavating. In total, we did about 23 square meters, down to about 1.5 meters, though much of that late and middle Holocene deposits were destroyed by looters. So if there's a silver lining to this story, it's that the early Holocene archaeology was easy to access and undisturbed. So it made the next few years very focused on that early record. And this is a photo of the crew in 2015 before we backfilled. So as I pointed out, a lot of those upper deposits, the middle and late archaic deposits, were destroyed. Towards the front of the shelter, they were more intact because the pit sloped to the back as the looters dug. So we found a number of features, both late archaic and middle archaic hearths or campfires that provided a lot of the chronological control, and seed and plant remains that I'll share with you in a moment. We had one early Holocene hearth, a late Paleo-Indian hearth there in the center, with a much smaller charcoal concentration to the side. There was a large rat nest in the middle with some artifacts incorporated, and a pit in the southeast corner there, 1407, 1408, and 1410. And I'll talk about those in a moment. So if we put all of the 89 radiocarbon dates that we acquired on charcoal, either isolated charcoal, campfire charcoal, or isolated animal bones, or detached pieces of textiles like baskets or sandals, of which we recovered a few fragmentary examples. This is what's called a summed probability distribution. And as you may know, a radiocarbon date is a statement of probability. And so the true age of the event that we're seeking to understand falls somewhere within these shaded curves. So you can do that with one radiocarbon date, or you can do that with 89 radiocarbon dates. And so we lump them all together to tell the story of human use of the shelter. And this is what we found. We found that there were at least 7 pulses of human activity, the most significant falling just after 10,000 years ago and going until after 9,000 years ago, a second pulse just before 8,000 years ago, and then periodic visits. There's 2 points that I want to make here before we move on. The first is that between about 8,000 and 4,500 years ago, there are almost no radiocarbon dates or other evidence of people in the Little Steamboat Point 1 rock shelter. Now, recall our conversation about the surface archaeology. That's also a period where those early archaic objects, like northern side notch points, are virtually absent in North Warner Valley. So we have the radiocarbon record and the surface archaeology record telling us that people aren't there in large numbers. This is also the case for after about 900 years ago. Please recall that one site that Scott Thomas worked on, the desert side notch point. If that site is set aside, there's almost no trace of people in the surface record, and that's also the case in the rock shelter. So the surface archaeology and the rock shelter archaeology are starting to converge to tell a story about prehistoric demography. Okay, so what do we find? We found an array of stemmed projectile points that are incredibly diverse in their form. Working with Dan Stuber, who many of you know, Dan has inferred that these were used as both projectile points in some cases, but also knives in others, and sometimes as both. And we see a very, very diverse range of form. And this is about 9,500 to 9,000 years ago. This is towards the end of the heyday of the Western STEM technology. And what I think we see here is people starting to experiment with form, looking for the next big thing, which of course would become notched points. Now, none of the ones in this photo are notched, but you see people trying new things. I just want to add as an aside that much of the work that I'm describing, including in particular the lithics, took place during COVID. So we all went into lockdown and we all went stir crazy, and I decided I would write a book. And that's the book that Dan mentioned at the beginning. Well, I needed his help, and we became very good friends, but we had to meet in person during COVID, which neither of us were excited about. So during one intense research session, we sat at a card table in my garage with masks far apart, with the door open, trying not to get each other sick. Another intense research session took place at a campground along the Chuacan River, upstream from Paisley, where we met in some sort of top secret rendezvous and looked at projectile points for an afternoon. And these were high stress, high intensity times, but honestly, this project kept me going in many ways. And so credit is due to Dan in this case. We also see the transition to foliate points. Some of you might call these cascade points. They are roughly contemporary with the end of Western STEM points and just before large side notch or northern side notch points. And so here are some slightly later examples. And on the bottom there, you see two examples of notched projectile points. And these are the earliest notch styles at the site. They're not northern side notch points as we classically think of them. And I think that these are examples, again, of people experimenting and trying the next efficient hafting mode. These foliate points primarily are used as knives. We also found a crescent. Don Petit found a crescent, and this is an unusual occurrence in a cave and rock shelter. We dated it to about 8,700 radiocarbon or 9,500 calendar years ago, and we submitted it for residue to John Fagan and Terry Osmond's group because it's an unusual find. So we were interested in identifying the protein on it, and these are often found around wetlands. So we were thinking duck or goose or muskrat or something like that. And it came back for pronghorn antelope, which was quite a surprise. The sediment around it came back negative for pronghorn. So it's not an issue of contamination. And so one possibility is that that positive reaction to pronghorn is telling us something about how this was attached to a handle or a shaft, maybe with sinew from an antelope, but that's largely speculative on my part. And then we have later points, Elko points, Rosegate points on the right, reflecting later occupations. But again, we're missing a slice of time between about 8,000 and 4,500 years ago in the rock shelter. That's reflected by both the lack of radiocarbon dates, but also lack of northern side notch points. So again, the archaeology of the rock shelters converging with the surface archaeology shown top and bottom. And notice the gap here during that early Archaic or Middle Holocene period right here in the rock shelter and here in the surface. Again, very few northern side notch points, 7 for the whole project. So what this is telling us is that at least far north Warner Valley is not seeing a lot of action. People probably moved to other well-watered areas, including perhaps the Fort Rock Basin, which seemed to be still relatively good compared to some of the neighboring basins. We have a wide array of bifaces. Most of them are made on non-local materials. People are bringing them into the site. They're laying them down and smashing them to produce new sharp edges. Again, that's something that Dan drew my attention to. The debitage and the bifaces are telling us that there's not a whole lot of biface manufacturing happening in the site. And the biggest discovery and the coolest thing and the interpretation that changed my entire understanding of this site, and again, this is full credit to Dan, is that he observed in the stone tool collection a high frequency of beginner mistakes. Now, I'm a beginner flint knapper, and so beginner mistakes are all I recognize. It's hard for me to recognize something that's produced by an expert. And Dan falls at the other end of the spectrum where he's immediately drawn to those beginner mistakes. And he said one day at one of these rendezvous, he said, "Jeff, you've got children or beginners at the site. You have families here." And I think of human behavior in terms of calories and benefits and costs. And I think of humans as like a non-gendered average entity. Gender doesn't, or at least it didn't figure much into my interpretations of the past. But as soon as we started talking and the more and more we talked, I realized there are men here, there are women here, and there are kids here, and there are kids learning the tricks of the trade. And that really changed my understanding of this project and archaeology in general. There's a wide variety of other tools, perforators and drills and scrapers, most of which are made on local materials. And this is telling us that there's a lot of different stuff going on at the site. It's not a single purpose location. All of those tools are made on several dozen obsidian sources from all over southeastern Oregon, northeastern California, and northwestern Nevada. And so this is telling us that the visitors to North Warner Valley and the Little Steamboat Point 1 rock shelter had connections across a very large area. Some of these sources show up once or twice. Some of them show up early, some of them show up late. But collectively, this is suggesting that there were very large and expansive social networks in the Great Basin, which of course shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. We also have shell beads coming from the Pacific coast, for at least 9,000 years. So people were well connected. The textile assemblage was pretty modest. At the back of the shelter, there was a large fissure in the ceiling that brought occasional moisture down. And so the best preserved perishables, which are shown here, tended to be found out front. We have a piece of catlow twine textile. Catlow twine technology spans 9,000 years in the Northern Great Basin. It's consistent with styles that the Klamath and Modoc were making relatively recently and still do today. We found sagebrush fibers, little bits and pieces of smaller basketry, and 5 sandals in a pit. And to this day, I don't understand the number 5 when it comes to shoes. I can wrap my head around 4 or 6 or 2. They generally come in pairs, but there were 5 here. One of which was consistent with the Klamath style sandal produced during ethnographic times. They were all extremely worn out and fragmentary. And what I think, and they all came from a storage pit. And what I think we see here is a collection of raw materials that were stored for later retrieval, either to use as fire starter or potentially to repair other worn out textiles like baskets or fibers. But again, that's relatively speculative on my part. There's a wide array of ornaments and tools, a steatite bead, a spindle whorl used to process plant fibers into cordage. This is the oldest dated let me back up. This is the oldest spindle whorl from a dated context. So we of course didn't directly date the stone in the Great Basin. It comes from the earliest levels of human occupation. We have pipe bowl, needles, awls, bone beads, shell beads, the oldest dated shell beads in the Northern Great Basin, whose isotopes are telling they came from very cold water, probably along the Washington or Oregon coast. And this contrasts with some of the smaller beads shown there, which came from Southern California, somewhere down near the Channel Islands in warmer water. We also have abalone shell and a wide range of decorative and functional objects made of stone, bone, and shell. Hammerstones, percussors, net weights, shaft straighteners, and again, a very diverse assemblage. And a ton of groundstone, 200 pieces, much of which was burned, found in all components, but primarily in those lower levels. And this was somewhat of a surprise because early archaeology in Oregon and Nevada is generally not groundstone focused. Plant processing, at least traditionally, our interpretation is plant processing only came online in the Middle Holocene and in later periods. So we had a lot of groundstone early on, some of it stained with ochre, some of it very heavily pecked. I think that this was probably what's called a hopper mortar, which would have held a bottomless basket where somebody would have, with a pestle, pounded seeds. I think that that's what might produce that kind of circular wear. Dark residue that we still haven't identified, another possible hopper mortar, more ochre. Much of this is coming from the lower levels. So we have this huge amount of burned groundstone, primarily concentrated in the southeastern portion of the rock shelter. Here's that most extensive early Holocene hearth, radiocarbon dated to 8,700 years ago, or about 9,500 calendar years ago, with just a ton of burned rock and groundstone here, which I'll come back to in a moment. More groundstone and more burned rock than you would associate with any sort of single hearth combustion feature. So what was in these hearths? This is work done by Dr. Jamie Kennedy at the University of Oregon, a good colleague and friend of mine. In that earliest hearth, which only contained 2% of the seeds, there was fiddlenecks and berries. In later hearths, there was goosefoot, saltbush, fiddleneck, tansy mustard, berries, and roots, and much of the same in those late archaic hearths. As Jamie pointed out, a lot of these are fall blossoming or fall producing food sources, strongly suggesting that people are at the rock shelter in the latest summer or into the fall. And that lined up with some evidence I'm about to share with you. But there was this question, very few seeds in the early levels, but a lot of groundstone. So what was that groundstone used for? One early hypothesis was that it was used to process some of the 1,000 individual animal carcasses of jackrabbits and to a lesser extent cottontails in these earliest levels. Jackrabbits and cottontails, but especially the jacks, are the most common food source in this rock shelter. Evan Pellegrini and Brian Hockett both looked at these, first asked the question, are these the product of raptors or humans? And they concluded that most of them are produced by humans. They then identified the species and the element. And what they realized was that there were a lot of appendicular elements, that is limb bones, shown here on the schematic in dark. And there were a lot of heads, but there were very few axial skeletal elements, things like backbones or pelvies. And so one of the hypotheses we had based on ethnographic information and the skeletal representation is people may have taken these rabbits and ground their bodies into a meal and preserved that for the coming winter. This is something that was documented ethnographically from time to time. It lined up with the zooarchaeological data I'm talking about. And what we think may have happened is, given that we think there are families at the rock shelter, and given the vast number of rabbit carcasses in the site, and the floral data, which is suggesting a fall occupation, what we think happened is that people were holding rabbit drives in North Warner Valley. The valley bottom is extremely well suited to jackrabbits. There are thousands, if not more, jackrabbits there today. And what we think happened at LSP is a family, or maybe two families, collected their share of that cooperative event, brought it to the rock shelter, and processed these carcasses, both for food, but perhaps also for their pelts to make rabbit skin robes and blankets. So that became another question, is how are people using the flake tools that are present in these lowest levels? So this is work done by a former student and friend of mine, Madeline Ware, and she created an experimental assemblage, so obsidian flakes that she made. She butchered some poor rabbits who, thank goodness, were already dead, and looked at the wear that accrued on those experimental tools, and then compared that wear to the archaeological tools from those lowest levels found with those 1,000 rabbit carcasses. And she identified through a use-wear study that there was a lot of hide being processed, with some carcass dismemberment also occurring, and very low percentage of meat being processed with those earliest tools. We think that this reflects, again, blanket or robe production, which involved processing hundreds of carcasses and using dozens to make an individual robe or blanket, which was every bit as warm as the Patagonia jackets we know today. So that was the story until last year. We thought the groundstone was being used to process those rabbit carcasses, turning them into meal. So this was a question. This was a hypothesis that we wanted to test. We had a master's student come to work with me, Hayden Kingery, who's now at Washington State, carrying out his PhD. And so I put Hayden on the case and asked him to conduct residue analyses of the groundstone in those earliest levels to identify if there was any rabbit residues through protein residue analysis. And so he submitted 50 samples to AINW there in Portland and got a huge bill. He said to me, "Jeff, this is the second most expensive purchase I've ever made, the first being my car." And this was, fortunately, it was grant money that he had acquired. And we had no positive results. There was no rabbit residue or any other animal residue on those 50 pieces of groundstone. And so for me, sadly, we had to conclude that my idea was wrong, that those groundstone were being used for something else. As part of his project, Hayden looked not for rabbit residues, but for plant residues, plant starches, which adhere to the surface of tools used to process plants. And he found both rice grass starch, which reflects late summer or fall occupations. So that's in line with everything else that I've been sharing and that we believed about the site. But he also found biscuit root starch, and biscuit root is most productively harvested in the spring. And so this is a new chapter to that story. It's that people were definitely there in the fall based on the faunal remains and the plant remains, but they were also at least there during some springs. And so the story has grown more complex just in the last year. I'm going to skip over this slide just for the sake of time. Heavy use early on is the take-home message, with periodic use during later times. Erica Bradley, another PhD student of mine, did some really amazing spatial analyses of the objects in those lower levels. And so what I'm describing to you now is a 40-centimeter thick layer of deposits that was intact, untouched by looting across the entire shelter interior, using radiocarbon dates from objects and HARs in those levels. We conducted a Bayesian analysis that restricted this time period in those 40 centimeters to somewhere between 9,600 to 9,300 years ago, probably a narrower window of about 175 to 420 years. Now, that's the limit of radiocarbon dating and how we can interpret it. So these clusters of objects that I'm showing you here, 4 of them, could easily have been produced in 4 consecutive years or within 3 or 4 decades. We can't identify time at a finer resolution with our current methods. But we have 4 clusters of artifacts that may represent 4 different occupation episodes. The size of the shelter could accommodate 7 to 10 people, or maybe twice that if some people were willing to sleep outside of the drip line. So we're not talking big groups of people. We may be talking a couple of families. People preferentially used the eastern half of the shelter, which, if we're talking fall occupations, would have remained in the sunlight for longer during the day, and that wall would have continued to radiate heat into the evening. We think that this is telling us that we've got separate groups by those families, separate visits by those families that Dan helped us identify through the presence of those novice napper beginner mistakes. Now, what about all that groundstone that's burned? As I mentioned previously, there's far more burned rock than any one campfire could produce through boiling stones or heating rocks or other activities like that. This is inconsistent with the small size and ephemeral nature of those early Holocene hearths. I think what this is telling us is that beyond our excavation block, to the south and off the screen, there may be some sort of intact roasting feature that could account for the large volume of burned rabbit bones and the huge volume of burned rocks. This would have been further removed from the shelter's rear in a better ventilated, more appropriate workspace for a feature like that. So that remains a question to be answered down the road should anyone ever wish to return to the site. So bringing this all together, human use in North Warner Valley extends back to at least 13,000 years ago, based on the presence of fluted points and early Western stem points that we know date to that time period at other locations. We see a big shift in the environment from lake and marsh focus to an open vegetation community that's ideal for jackrabbits. Early on, it seems to be that marshes produce the food, but as the marshes disappeared, people moved into the rock shelter for the first time, and rabbits became at the top of the menu. Nowhere in the valley do we have any evidence for villages or longer-term occupations. So Warner Valley always seemed to be a destination, not a long-term occupation. And people may have been coming from further south in the valley or in the adjacent basins, including Lake Abert. Instead, we see short-term use by families and perhaps occasionally hunters without kids, as reflected by lower frequencies of beginner mistakes in the stone tool assemblages during different time periods. So we have more questions, of course. Foremost is learning more about that groundstone. Hayden is going to continue his work with that assemblage. We're also really interested in seeing if we can identify shorter term pulses of wet periods during the Holocene further south in the valley, and if those wet periods correspond with increased or decreased visits to the rock shelter. So that's a question that's going to take some additional work to answer. And that is all I have for you. I have one parting comment, and then I'm happy to answer questions. As Dan mentioned, this is the book. This was my COVID project. It was written on a MacBook Air at my kitchen counter with headphones in while my wife, Lindsay, held down the fort during my productive times. It had so much help from a range of characters and colleagues. And so I'm really excited that this is out finally. This was a bucket list for me professionally. You can get it at the University of Utah Press, which has long supported Great Basin archaeology. If you use the code PAC35, I think that'll get you 35% off. It's also available on Amazon, but I feel like they don't necessarily need your money like the University of Utah Press does. So if you elect to get it, go for the UU Press, please. And now I'm done talking. Thank you so much, everybody.
Hey. Thank you, Jeff. Nice talk.
Thank you. I'm happy if anybody has any questions.
Questions?
If you're all tired, that's fine too.
All right, we have a question here in the front row.
You said that you found seashells in the site and also signs of abalone shells. That's from California, Los Angeles area, Channel Islands. Is there any indication from other sites in California that might indicate a trade route from the Los Angeles area, go up the Central Valley and into the Oregon desert, or does it go along the coast, then come inland, or do you have any idea of what these trade routes from the coast is from other sites?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are marine shells being traded to desert communities in exchange maybe for desert resources like obsidian, which is one thing that we could trace? The earliest obsidian on the California coast is in excess of 12,000 years on the Channel Islands of all places. That's work done by John Erlandson, just a tiny couple of flakes, but it's from a source far interior in the Mojave Desert. So that tells us that early on, people on the coast and people inland are communicating and trading. Now back to your specific question. We can look at the oxygen isotopes in shells, which will tell us the temperature of water in which they grew. And we can correct for variations in ocean temperature going back 10,000 years using different records. And so the larger of those olivella shell beads that I showed you, the ones that we directly dated to about 9,500 years ago, those grew in very cold water, somewhere in far northern California, Oregon, or even Washington. Later in time, so that's telling us that at least at that period in time, or that one trade episode, those were probably coming maybe up the Columbia, or maybe just straight across inland through some of the other rivers that go to the coast. Later in time, the shell beads, the olivella shell beads, grew in warmer water. And we think that means south of Point Conception in California, not necessarily the Channel Islands, but at that latitude. And so that's telling us that there's some sort of different trade network. Tobin Botman, who I think is with ODOT in Salem, did his master's thesis presenting different models of trade like you're asking about. And he presented 3 scenarios. Dennis Jenkins has done some work in many of his projects, arguing that later in time, these shell beads from California are coming up along the eastern Sierra front and into the Great Basin. So east of the Cascades, east of the Sierra. This is going to take a lot more work to evaluate, but we do have some clues and at least some working hypotheses about those routes. And that's a really great question.
All right, and we have another question back here.
Jeff, can you stop screen sharing, please?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
You were able to go below where the looters were, and you had some things from above. What's your speculation as to what they might have been able to take? Have you been able to speculate on that?
No, and it's not something I want to dwell on because it's just upsetting. There is a big boulder, a piece of the cliff fell down out in front that was conveniently like a table, and we found piles where people were sorting the the bad stuff from the good stuff, and the good stuff disappeared, and the broken bits, the stuff that the kids made maybe was left behind. And so people were there long enough to collect enough stuff to sort it into the keeps and the leaves. We didn't find a lot of textiles in the areas that we excavated, and we did get to work in some undisturbed later deposits, the period at which the stuff that we did find dates to. But yeah, it's hard to know. It's upsetting for sure. It's something that I've thought about, for a decade now, and wondered, how was it our presence there that tipped somebody off? Was it anybody we crossed paths with in the desert? It's just it's something that you don't think about very often as an archaeologist, that our work could conceivably attract the attention of people who are less ethical and willing to do a lot of damage. So I don't know is my answer to your question.
Thanks, Jeff. David, do you have any questions from the Zoom audience? Zeke, are you there? No, he's not. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody in attendance.
Appreciate it. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. It was really great.
Thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And if that other guy is still talking on TV, the president, you go check out, see what he has to say.
Thanks.
Okay, guys, we gotta wrap it up here, so.